better move that.
Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 30th of January 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish.
Cutting things a bit fine today, Brian?
A little bit, yes.
Okay, well, let's get straight on then. And of course, what did we have yesterday? The delightful Theresa back in the House of Commons to try to continue the Brexit charade. And indeed, it has been continued. And the outcome of yesterday in Parliament was, Brian, absolutely nothing. So an amendment was passed, which will see Theresa May go back to Europe to try to renegotiate some kind of backstop arrangement which will satisfy everybody. We found out for certain that Parliament is not going to tolerate a no-deal scenario, apparently. So perhaps it's a bit less likely today than it was 2 days ago that there'll be a second referendum. I think there's still going to be a second referendum, but anyway, we'll come on to it in a second. And as a result of all this, Jeremy Corbyn has now agreed to engage with Theresa May, so the fix is probably in. As I say, an amendment was passed which will see Theresa May go back to Europe and negotiate the backstop. Michel Barnier saying absolutely not. The EU is standing by the existing withdrawal agreement. He said the EU institutions remain united and we stand by the agreement we've negotiated with the UK. So she's going to be back in Parliament again with the results of her efforts on the 13th of February for what they're describing as another meaningful vote, Brian, but basically really not very much happened yesterday of interest.
The language was incredible, Mike, and a couple of people said to me they've been listening to reports on the BBC, and one lady said, I listened to what they said, but I couldn't actually understand what they were saying because the language was so weird, it was so vague.
Well, this is it. They don't want to actually make any commitments to anything, so they're using...
So it's a mixture of newspeak and it's deliberately designed to deceive. It's a fog of reporting. But what did come through was that, of course, 17.4 million people vote to leave the European Union. They didn't say we want to leave with conditions. They said we want to leave. But no, the government's decided, no, we can't do that. The government has got to decide what needs to happen. Well, where does that take us? I think it takes us that we need to have a look at the German military might. And this has come to light over the last few days. It's quite extraordinary because nothing is being reported in the mainstream press. So I just came out with this banner headline, German military might in meltdown, but it's full steam ahead for the EU Defence Union. And there's total silence in the media. So where can we go for reports on what's happening with the German military at the moment? Well, we've got to go to smaller, I'll say independent reporters. I've been able to check some of the information being put forward, and I'm going to say it's got substance to it. It is correct. And there's quite a lot of information if you spend the time. But let's have a little look at what they're saying, because basically the German Navy is the centre of this, because the German Navy's just had to hand a ship back as being unacceptable. The German Navy couldn't accept the ship from the builders. This is it. It's a Type 125 class. And amongst other things, it's got a slight list on it. It doesn't actually float upright, which was a bit of a shame. But also it's too heavy. And then huge problems on board. We'll come on to some more of those.
Was this built in a German shipyard?
Indeed, and embarrassingly, I believe the same shipyard that built the Bismarck, so there's a little bit of a drop in reputation there. But this is a UK Defence Journal. Now, we've challenged this organisation on a couple of occasions, but this report seems to be very credible. Can the German Navy be saved? Well, it's nice to blame budget cuts. The Marines problems go well beyond a lack of money. The German Navy has a major problem with all its major components, submarine, surface ships, and what's left of its naval air capability. So this is absolutely fundamental stuff, but huge problems for the German Navy. It says, public perceptions notwithstanding, the mission of the Marine is to fill its NATO commitments. Unfortunately, due to poor planning and decision making and lack of funding, it's incapable of fulfilling its primary mission requirements. Unless changes are made promptly and quickly, the capabilities will degrade even further over the coming years. So remarkable, Mike, that the French are leaping into bed with the Germans in a military sense. We've got the Treaty of Aachen. And of course, UK is doing the same, even though Theresa May and her Conservatives are not telling the public the truth. So here we are, German Navy experiences LCS syndrome in spades as new frigate fails sea trials. With 90% new systems, the bigger, lighter crewed monster frigate is not ready for duty. It calls itself a frigate, but it's 7,000 tons. That'd normally be destroyer size. So the German Navy has a lot of problems right now. It has no working submarines. This appears to be true to date. I've checked the website this morning to try and find out more information on the status of the submarines. It's difficult though, because as I say, the mainstream press not reporting on it. But we've got helicopters older than its pilots, and it's talking about problems with the Sea Lynx and the Sea King. And then it's got problems with the maritime patrol aircraft as well. And this was where I got the leaning bit. On top of the information systems issue, there are other problems. The ship leans a little to the right. It's overweight and can't make top speed with its first time deployed combined turbine propulsion system that combines diesel and gas. And then we've got more problems with the German maritime patrol aircraft. They took over some from the Dutch and then found that essentially the things were clapped out, I think is the correct expression. And there's talk about getting involved with France for a major new design. This is the so-called MAWS system, Maritime Airborne Warfare System. But this is not stuff that's due to even come onto the books until 2025 or even later, and 2030 being mentioned here. So at the moment, we've got a problem. But I noticed this. It's talking about autonomous, efficient and sovereign maritime patrol capability in Europe. I thought that was a very interesting little comment there, Mike.
Is that Europe, EU sovereignty they're
Well,
talking
that's
about?
what I wondered, so we'll bring that in. Is this what they're really talking about? Because when we discussed this before the start of the news today, we said, is this breaking down the military in order to bring in the European Defence Union? And let's remember, of course, that David Cameron paved the way with just one small part of the demise of the Royal Navy by scrapping the Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft. So an aircraft very successful. It had already got a very successful upgrade designed, and they were all simply scrapped. Looking back now, is this or was this part of the route through to getting rid of UK's military to push us into that European defence system, Mike?
I mean, what you're describing here, Brian, seems pretty significant, but a similar picture could be painted of the British Navy, and you know, how many operational submarines do we actually have? How many frigates can we actually get to see? How many ships can we get to see at all that are fully manned? Do we have any engineers? Can our ships sail in warm water? These questions I think we've covered in this program, and you know, we are in no better position.
We're in no better position. So we are to believe that suddenly nation states that were perfectly competent about sorting out their military requirements, building ships, building tanks, building aircraft, we could do it, the French could do it, the Germans could do it. All of a sudden, nobody can build anything that works. And what we're starting to see, of course, is the drive for there needs to be a solution to this problem. And I think we can guess what that solution is. But let's ram this point home, because here we're into defence news. We're coming up the scale on the media-based reporting. Germany picks up 2 thorny defence and diplomacy assignments in 2019. And basically, they've been given leadership of NATO's highest alert combat formation and a 2-year seat on the United Nations Security Council. So what this article is saying is here is Germany now being pushed to the forefront with roles which require it to have a competent military, but what they haven't got is that competent military system. So it says the two new responsibilities follow recent pledges by Berlin to play a more active role in global affairs, offering German Chancellor Merkel an instant test to make good on those proclamations during the final years of her tenure. But read this: the Bundeswehr, plagued by equipment shortfalls, management problems, or both, depending on who is asked, has had to dig deep to assemble the needed equipment for the task force lead. In the end, funneling supplies from across the force to the tip of the spear appears to have worked, but it has depleted the readiness of many units. And what they're talking about here is exercises where they were supposedly resupplying a new Russian front. They just about managed it to get it working, but only just. And it goes on to here. There's Foreign Minister Heiko Maas on January the 1st tweeted a list of diplomatic objectives for Germany during its Security Council tenure. They include countering climate change and related global security effects. So we can't manage the military, but we're already moving on to seeing whether we can sort out climate change. And this is where it gets interesting, because if we get into the European Union's own media system, and here we've got the European Council on Foreign Relations, they're saying Germany's defence commitments, nothing but paper tigers. So even the EU is admitting that the so-called military powerhouse of Europe isn't working. A lot of information here which people can have a look at, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this one here. It says, thanks to the emphasis it placed on collective defence as a primary task for the Bundeswehr from 2015 onwards, the German Ministry of Defence won modest budget increases to recreate war stocks of ammunition. Brackets, if Russia had invaded Europe in 2014, the Bundeswehr would have run out of ammunition within just 1 week. And it goes on to say that Germany has promised a 3-division army to the European Union. What's the scale of that? Well, roughly at the height of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the Germans had 175 armoured divisions operating, and now they can barely manage 3 divisions. So how can the European Defence Union might be sold to this country as something that we want to be getting closer to? It's clearly a disaster. Surely UK should be moving as far away from that EU system as possible and get back to building our own military equipment.
We'll come on to a little bit more of that in a second. Let's head across the Atlantic to the United States. And well, later this week, Chinese delegates will be heading over to Washington for trade talks. These trade talks have been organized through the dialogue between Trump and Xi Jinping. But just as these trade talks are about to happen, of course, we've got the ramping up of problems with Huawei, the Chinese technology company in the United States. So, for example, Canada recently arrested their chief financial officer. The United States has now formally requested for her to be extradited to the United States. In the meantime, we've got Goldman Sachs pushing out warnings about companies that are relying on the Chinese economy to continue their trade. So we've got this headline from CNBC. Goldman has warned Nvidia could blow up because of China, and says these companies could be next. So they're listing Nvidia, Broadcom, Micron Technology, Qualcomm, Qorvo, Skyworks Solutions, Win, Resort, and so on. Of course, Apple has been getting quite a few headlines in the last couple of days because their sales of iPhones have dropped as a result, allegedly, of the slowdown in the Chinese economy. So everything's coming anti-China in the United States just as these trade talks are about to happen. But it doesn't end there. Yesterday, Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, he's on the left there, and FBI Director Christopher Wray on the right were giving evidence at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Well, this was in parallel with the release of a report written by them called Statement for the Record, Worldwide Threat Assessment of the US Intelligence Community. So they launched an all-out attack on the potential for good relations between Russia and China and the United States. Mr. Wray said the Chinese counterintelligence threat is more deep, more diverse, more vexing, more challenging, more comprehensive, and more concerning than any other counterintelligence threat I can think of. And he went on to say that Russia and China are the chief threat to the United States today. So here is the document that they published. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of bits out of this, because under this section entitled Emerging and Disruptive Technologies and Threats to Economic Competitiveness, they say that many foreign leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin, view strong indigenous science and technology capabilities as key to their country's sovereignty, economic outlook, and national power. They say that rapid advances are occurring around the world in biotechnology, material science, manufacturing technology, artificial intelligence, and global space industry, and that China and Russia are more allied than they've ever been since the 1950s. They say China presents a persistent cyber espionage threat and a growing attack threat to our core military and critical infrastructure systems. They claim that Russia is already staging cyber attacks against assets to allow it to disrupt and damage US civilian and military infrastructure during a crisis. They say our adversaries and strategic competitors probably already are looking to the 2020 US elections as an opportunity to advance their interests. It's anticipated that China and Russia will collaborate, taking advantage of rising doubts in some places about the liberal democratic model. Both countries probably will use the UN as a platform to emphasize sovereignty narratives that reflect their interests and redirect discussions away from human rights, democracy, and good governance. And then they say China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, is seeking to assert China's model of authoritarian capitalism as an alternative, an implicitly superior development path abroad. Beijing has stepped up efforts to reshape the international discourse around human rights, especially within the UN system, to erode norms such as the notion that the international community has a legitimate role in scrutinizing other countries' behavior on human rights, and to advance narrow definitions of human rights based on economic standards. So, Brian, I don't know what you think of all that, but I find it quite amusing that, and perhaps somewhat hypocritical, that they suggest that any country's leaders that are attempting to build a strong indigenous science and technology capability, any suggestion that could be a key to the country's sovereignty should be a threat to Western governments. It's a threat perhaps to a particular globalist ideology that we're seeing pursued through Western governments at the moment.
And that's a positive thing in as much, Mike, that it's now coming to the surface. I think we're being able to see these people for who they are. Whether we've got Treason May supposedly talking conservative policy, it's not conservative policy. This is policy which has come from the international banking cabal, the people driving for the rules-based international order. And yes, that says it, doesn't it? That if countries are working to build their own technology and science base to build products themselves, this is anathema to the rules-based international order, and it's got to be stamped out.
Absolutely, but it's interesting, isn't it, that China is now being brought into this narrative in a much stronger way than it has been up until now with Russia. And indeed, it continues because the US Army has decided that it wants a supergun with a 1,000-mile range, Brian. It's going to be the ultimate standoff weapon, according to this article in military.com. And they're saying that that they're in the market for this long range. It's being described as a cannon. On a tactical level, we need to be able to outrange our adversaries' guns with comparable caliber and organization, said the Army Secretary Mark Esper. And he said, you can imagine a scenario where the Navy feels it cannot get into the South China Sea because of Chinese vessels naval vessels, but we can from a fixed location. So we've got the US attempting to create a supergun. You might describe that as a dumb ballistic weapon.
It's certainly dumb. We'll come on to that.
Yes, we'll come on to that in a second. But the Chinese then have released this little bit of video of their new weapon, the DF-26, and this is apparently a ballistic missile which can target moving targets, and particularly it's being described in the press as being an anti-US aircraft carrier weapon, an information network connected to the warhead, which possibly includes satellites, ground and naval radar. In addition to radar, and the missile itself will constantly update the location of the moving target, informing flight control where to guide the missile, is what the Chinese government is saying, or Chinese military is saying about it. So that, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, is a pretty major step forward.
It's a huge step forward because, of course, before the only way that other nations could deal with American carriers was essentially by building carriers themselves. And this is why America has been able to literally dominate the globe, because you move an aircraft carrier, you're moving more planes than the average country has in a land-based air force. And the Americans could get away with this. In the last, what are we talking about, 10 years, I think we've seen this phenomenal change. And I think what you've just described there with a 1,000-mile rail gun, British technology probably, is that they are floundering now to find some sort of defensive system. So I think they're completely outclassed, and we'll ram the point home, outclassed because the Chinese and the Russians have gone it alone, had confidence in their own countries to produce these systems. But the other thing with the Americans that came into my mind is the USS Zumwalt, which was supposed to be their latest and greatest stealth ship, has been an utter disaster. That was supposed to have some new long-range weapons system, and they've just cancelled the orders for the $800,000 projectiles. So I think American Navy is in dire straits at the moment.
So how can we pursue this narrative against Russia and China while we're clearly at European level and the US level in a state of utter collapse?
How can we pursue it?
Yes.
Rhetorical question, presumably.
Well, yeah, because I mean, ultimately, if it was to be pursued to real action, we haven't got a hope.
Well, we've just seen the state of the German armed forces, supposed to be the backbone to the European armed forces. So, yeah, there's something very strange going on. I think we've now got to the point where we have a political agenda. That's the global new rules-based international order agenda driving forward, lost track of reality. It's destroying nation states, destroying military, but the rhetoric says we've got to accuse Russia, we've got to accuse China. So that rhetoric rolls forward, and in the
reality can't keep up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's keep on with the attacks against China then, because Jeremy Hunt, our illustrious Foreign Secretary, has weighed in now on press freedoms in China. He said, "I'm concerned by the findings of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China report about media freedoms and the deteriorating situation for journalists in China. Its publication coincides with the sentencing of journalist Li Fu, one of over 60 journalists currently detained in China. The UK is also concerned about the sentencing of others. We urge the Chinese government to ensure fundamental civil and political rights are protected in line with China's constitution and its international commitments." Now, I'm not aware that Britain has actually got any journalists in prison at the moment. They may have, but it does amuse me, this statement. "We urge the Chinese government to ensure fundamental civil and political rights are protected," since it is the British government which is attempting at every stage to undermine our fundamental civil and political rights to speak out on social media, on alternative media platforms. And it is our government that now has the British mainstream press and the European and US mainstream press so much under their thumb that the hypocrisy here is pretty tangible. And you've got to ask, Brian, bearing in mind that Britain is leading this drive to shut down free speech in the West because their excuse, of course, is extremism. We've got to remember that it was Treason May that brought the social media companies into 10 Downing Street to get them to cooperate. The social media companies have been under sustained pressure from the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. They're now, British government now absolutely encouraging the use of so-called fact-checking organisations like Full Fact. And of course, the biggest aspect of the hypocrisy of this is the Integrity Initiative programme. You know, where does a counter-disinformation programme on the scale of what we have seen from Integrity Initiative and the Foreign Office, where does that leave freedom of the press in Britain?
In dire straits, and we'll be able to give a bit more to this.
Yeah.
So let's have a look at The Guardian here. Proposed UK law could expose journalist emails, says critics. And if we get in a bit deeper, this is something very nasty on its way. British police forces could find it easier to access journalists' private emails as a result of legislation making its way through Parliament. And this is the Crime Overseas Production Orders Bill, due to be debated in the Commons, and paving the way for the Home Office to surrender up the content of our electronic communications to foreign governments. Well, that's only part of it. The legislation is designed to make it easier for British authorities to access data stored overseas by foreign technology companies such as Facebook and Google. But relax, because of course this is all to protect children. Don't worry about freedom of speech and clamping down on journalists, because according to the government, this is all to protect children. We'll lead you through to that conclusion. But Rebecca Vincent here from Reporters Without Borders has had this to say: the fact that this bill is incredibly technical and complex is perhaps why it's largely evaded public scrutiny for so long, but the implications are potentially very damaging to press freedom and broader human rights. Now, interesting that if you look at her organisation, you could be a bit suspicious about it. It's linked up with, I think it's 7 other non-government organisations. Is this truly independent? I'm going to say I don't know, but credit where it's due, because they are making the right warning. And if you go to their website, which I encourage you to read the full article, they've got this headline: UK NGOs concern over press freedom implications of the Crime Overseas Production Orders Bill. And if I just read you a bit of it, they sent a letter, so this is just 2 paragraphs from the letter. It says Section 20(2) of the Investigatory Powers Act 2016 sets a minimal threshold for authorities to access content. A warrant can only be deemed necessary if it's in the interests of national security, the prevention or detection of serious crime, defined in S263. Though reasonable grounds are not required, or in the interests of the economic well-being of the United Kingdom, so far as it relates to national security. However, the threshold set out in the Crime Overseas Production Orders Bill is that there must be reasonable grounds for believing that an indictable offence has been committed, clause 4(3), unless the order is sought for the purposes of a terrorist investigation, in which case no evidentiary threshold is required at all. Now, we've still got to look at more details here, but they're talking some pretty serious stuff. What's the Home Office got to say? Well, this is from the Home Office, but Sajid Javid is the man, of course. They say no one should be above the law. The tools available to our law enforcement must be fit for the online world in which we live. 99% of data linked to child abuse is held overseas, and the faster we can get it, the quicker we can stop abusers. This is by the same government that, of course, has got Melanie Shaw and other child abuse whistleblowers in prison and psychiatric units in order to protect high-level members of the establishment and political arena. But we're told, don't worry, because we need more access to your data to protect those children.
But this gives them potentially easier access to journalists' emails, therefore exposing sources, therefore putting press freedom in this country at risk. But in the meantime, we're criticising China for what it's doing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hypocrisy. And if you didn't pick up on that Sajid Javid slide, of course, his profession was originally a Deutsche banker. Somebody said in our chat box today, more or less, does the policy come from Deutsche Bank, or is this genuine government policy? Who knows?
Well, sticking with big tech companies and data and so on, this is Facebook has been exposed by TechCrunch here. TechCrunch is saying that people taking part in this program, so the headline is Facebook pays teens to install virtual private network with spies on them. So participants were aged between 13 and 35. Facebook claims that only 5% of the participants were aged under 16. But participants, including those aged 13 to 17, have been paid up to $20, which is £15.30 a month, to open up their phones to deep analysis. So basically what was happening is that they were putting a piece of software on iPhones. And this particular story is about iPhones because Apple has now objected to this, and Facebook has stopped their iPhone, or removed their iPhone software, but they're still continuing it on Google phones, any Google phones. So the iOS app breached Apple's privacy protection policies because it was installed, it was kind of side-loaded, it wasn't installed through the App Store, it was installed using techniques that were designed for developers, so that developers could install software for testing on handsets that were only to be used internally within the organization. And instead of doing that, Facebook rolled this out to, well, you might call them customers, but because Facebook was paying them a nominal sum, Facebook was considering themselves apparently to be within the Apple's policies because by paying people, these people were effectively becoming employees in inverted commas. So anyway, TechCrunch reported that Facebook has used social media ads to target teenagers for the scheme. Facebook saying that this isn't the case. Facebook is saying that this software wasn't marketed directly through Facebook. It was only marketed through third-party companies. So you couldn't sort of go to a Facebook website and volunteer to do this. But it was enabling Facebook to get information from people's phones, including children's phones, which included things like the contents of private messages in chat apps, the contents of emails, the contents of web browsing histories, logs of applications that were installed, when they were used, how they were used, history of where the owner had been physically, so in other words, location data, and also data usage. So it was much broader than the type of information that Facebook is gathering on a day-to-day basis. And really what TechCrunch seems to be alleging is that many people were sort of sucked into installing this thing in the first place through these third-party companies. Facebook denies that absolutely. They say that anybody that was under the age of 16 had to get parental permission and written parental permission, but they were refusing to say how that parental permission was actually gathered. So as I say, this program still continues to run for people that have Android phones, but Apple seems to have put a stop to it on their platform. But it is just goes to demonstrates the degrees that these companies are prepared to go to try to get into people's lives. And of course, it doesn't just affect the person who's installed the software on their phone. If you're in communications with that person, then information about you is going out as well. So this part of it needs to be dealt with, but British government isn't concerned about that so long as Facebook is dealing with so-called extremist content online.
Which brings it down to individual people to make the protest, and that's really what we need.
Absolutely. Now, Ian Crane will be in the studio this week, so tomorrow evening, Thursday live programme, 7:30, Humanity versus Insanity. I'm not 100% certain whether he will do a Fracking Nightmare this week, but certainly Humanity versus Insanity will be at 7:30, and if you tune in then you'll find out whether Fracking Nightmare is taking place. And also just mention that AV 9.1 DVDs are for sale now. I haven't quite got them up on the UK column website yet, but that will be the case this afternoon. So from about 3 o'clock this afternoon, you will be able to get AV 9.1 DVDs if you're interested from the UK column website. So Brian was speaking, Alex Thompson, Patrick Henningsen, Dr. Graham Downing and Ian R. Crane, and by all accounts it was an excellent event. So if you want to get your DVDs, they will be available through us from 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Okay, Venezuela.
Venezuela, yes. So what's been going on? Maduro says he's willing to negotiate with the opposition. Well, all kinds of stuff happening over the last few days. We had Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, National Security Advisor John Bolton holding a press conference a couple of days ago announcing that all the property of the National Oil Company, PDVSA, and anything, or at least anything that was subject to US jurisdiction would be blocked. So that's $7 billion or so of assets. Of course, we mentioned on Monday's programme the Bank of England's refusal to return £1.2 billion of gold to the Venezuelan government. But Sir Alan Duncan then, after the news programme on Monday, said that perhaps that gold might be given to the opposition leader Guaido, who has already written to Theresa May to ask for that gold. Duncan said that the final decision would be the Bank of England's, not the government's. Well, we'll see. And then John Bolton yesterday, he made the mistake, in inverted commas, of accidentally letting the press see his A4 pad that he had with him, on which he had written the words 5,000 troops to Colombia. So that was just by accident, of course. In fact, Brazil and Colombia have said that absolutely not, this isn't going to happen. I believe Mexico has also made noises, so the chances of military action perhaps are receding slightly. Venezuela's Supreme Court then today banned Juan Guaido from leaving the country, and they've frozen his bank accounts. Maduro, as I say, is now saying that perhaps he is willing to negotiate with the opposition. So we'll see what happens there. In the meantime, Sergei Lavrov said we're concerned about what the US and his closest allies are doing with respect to Venezuela, brazenly violating all imaginable norms of international law and actually openly pursuing the policy aimed at overthrowing the legitimate government in that Latin American country. So, there we go.
So when we've got gold, Mike, Gordon Brown gives it away, effectively.
Yes.
But if we get the opportunity to steal somebody else's gold and assets, that's no problem at all. So British government telling Venezuela now what they should be doing. Who should rule Venezuela? We can't run the British military, but we're going to tell Venezuela what to do.
Absolutely. I think they've got about 2 or 3 more days to decide to hold elections before the UK decides that it will recognise Mr. Guaido as the interim president.
To get some more violence and trouble going up in the world. It's quite remarkable, isn't it? So while the British government is doing this, which is wrecking countries overseas, people at home, of course, have got to be kept on a diet of news which is going to really take their minds off things. Now, the next image is a bit strong, so if you don't want to look at it, don't. But this is from our local paper, essentially the Plymouth Herald, but this is the online Plymouth Live. I was reading the article when this image came up, which I thought was so disgusting we'd comment on it on its own right. So your guess, Mike, what is the news topic? What is the news topic? Who knows? But let's have a look. It's essentially a top cop, what's the gentleman name? DCC Netherton, who's now, I think, National Advisor for Major Disasters. Top cop reveals what would happen in hours after a major disaster. Devon and Cornwall officer, excuse me, is the national lead for civil contingencies, excuse me, and tells Plymouth Live he's preparing for a catastrophic Brexit.
Right.
Brexit. So we need a zombie in the Brexit article. Suffering here, but excuse me. And the article is so bad, Mike, I'm going to encourage viewers and listeners to go and have a look at it. Top cop reveals what would happen in hours after a major disaster, because basically everything is thrown in. There's Brexit, there could be flood, there could be those nasty Russians. It goes on, mixed with sort of cartoons, 17th century woodcut graphics of flooding. It is.
So what is this designed to do to the average reader?
Just mess their minds up, Mike, because I wanted to use a slightly rude word or description. It is to mess people's minds up. But let's have a look at what it said for Brexit, because it used a graphic for Brexit. 5 ways you'll be affected if the UK leaves the EU with no deal. Now remember, the article is about a police officer who's in control of major disaster management, and Brexit is in the article as if it, here they are, 5 ways you'll be affected if the UK leaves the EU with no deal. You'll need to renew your passport early. Okay, so obviously this is something that's going to need police involvement, because many people are going to be so upset about this, they'll probably be taking to the streets. Brace yourself for the next one. If you're taking your pet abroad, you'll need to visit the vet 4 months in advance. So this is a matter for the police and national security and the Cobra unit, because your pussy won't be able to go abroad unless pussy has been suitably vaccinated. Your holiday flight could be grounded. British Airlines, hoping to fly planes between the EU and UK, would have to win permission from each separate country. And they're going to say no, of course, and collapse their airports and loss of revenue. I don't think so. 4, you could be barred from using Netflix and Spotify on holiday. So that's obviously of major national significance. And your mobile phone roaming charges may be hiked. So you have this dross. Now, has this come from Plymouth Live itself, or is this recommended by the BBC embedded democracy reporters? We don't know. We've got a video which is crudely attempting to suggest that anybody who's a yellow vest is actually a rabid Brexit supporter, although of course many are. And we'll just end by, woven through this fabric of comic theatre reporting is well, of course, those nasty Russians are capable of anything from a direct invasion to interfering with the NHS's IT systems, to cyber warfare.
Would it be terribly unfair of me to say that if China's putting journalists in prison, that it's about time Britain started doing the same? Because these guys are not doing their jobs.
Well, they're turkeys voting for Christmas, because you can see what's coming in here, which is a dictatorship is installing itself in UK. And these journalists, who the people who should be standing up for free speech and also to do their own job, are simply churning out this utter dross. So it's going to catch them eventually. We'll leave on that note. Have a look at the article though and see what you think, and let us know. I'll just end on the note that there are many people asking about Melanie Shaw at the moment. I will make a short report on Melanie this coming Friday. We're very sure that Melanie is in Rampton now. We're not sure how she got there, because this did not appear to be one of the decisions made in court, but more on that on Friday. That's it for today. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you Friday, 1 p.m. Bye-bye.